continuing this morning with our sermon series on Let Your Light Shine by looking at a message themed, Seeing God in the Midst of the City. We're going to talk a little bit about that this morning, and I'm going to start with a story from the Gospel of Luke where two disciples, James and John, were having a hard time seeing God in the midst of the city. So hear that now from Luke chapter 9, beginning with verse 51 and going down to verse 56. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. This is God's word. Amen. Let's pray together. Help us, Father in heaven, to see you in our midst. In the midst of our city, in the midst of our church, and in the midst of our very lives. There are your children gathered here in this room, some of whom need to hear from you today. There are men and women who came in here, I don't doubt, desperate to have a word of grace spoken into their lives. And so I pray that your Spirit now would be poured out upon us. And for those who come in with searching hearts, for those who come in with great need, we pray that you would meet that need as only you can. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between country and city for a few minutes. Have you ever noticed how in our culture, everything country is depicted as noble and clean and good, and everything city related is seen as suspect and dirty and bad? Well, this is a story, country versus city, that actually goes back a long time. And I mean, it goes back a long time. As a matter of fact, one of the first known versions of pitting city against country is one of the best known of Aesop's fables. And I'm talking here, of course, about the city mouse and the country mouse. Now, you may know this story from a children's book growing up, or perhaps even from a cartoon. But the story of the city mouse and the country mouse is one of Aesop's original fables. This is a story that goes back some 2,500 years. So let's look at it a little bit. The city mouse and the country mouse goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a city mouse, and he went out to visit his cousin in the country. And he brought with him fantastic stories about what city life was like, how sophisticated everything was, and how delicious the food tasted. Meanwhile, the country mouse had to welcome him into a humble little hovel out in the field. And he fed him with standard country fare, dried kernels of corn and a couple of stale acorns. Well, as the city mouse was trying to look gracious, he nibbled a little bit on the corn and the acorns, but he mostly did it just to keep up appearances. But at the same time, as he shared his stories of city life, the country mouse was absolutely taken with all of it. And he wished somehow that he could go and visit the city. Well, they went to bed that night, and all the country mouse did was dream of the city. And when they got up the next morning, he was delighted when the city mouse, when the city mouse invited him to come for a visit to the city. And so into the city they went. And they got to the great big house where the city mouse lived. And then they went into that big house and they got to the great big dining room in the middle of that house. And they opened the door, and lo and behold, there were the remains of a great banquet that had just been had on the table. And so the city mouse and the country mouse scurried up onto the table, and the city mouse said, "See, here are the sweetmeats, and here are the vegetables, and here are the breads of different kinds. And if you look over on that stand, there are pastries with all kinds of delicious jellies and jams." And the city mouse and the country mouse dove their little mouse noses into the food and began to gorge themselves. But no sooner had they started than they heard a scratch on the door. And the door pushed open, and they heard the meow of the family cat. And so the city mouse and the country mouse dove under the nearest napkins, and there they sat, holding one another, huddling out of fear, until the cat walked on through the room. Well, finally, after what seemed like hours, the city mouse and the country mouse got out from under the napkin, and they started to feast again. But no sooner had they started again, but the door to the dining room flung open, and all the family servants walked in, accompanied, of course, by the family dog, who was waving his tail and sniffing every which way. The city mouse and the country mouse jumped off of the table, scurried across the floor, and dove into a hole in the wall where they had to stay the rest of the night for protection's sake. Well, after this episode, the country mouse said to the city mouse, "City mouse, thank you for your hospitality and welcoming me into this fantastic place where you live. But after all, I think that I would rather be poor and happy and safe than rich while frightened with danger and uncertainty at every moment in the city." Now, keep in mind that this is a story that is 500 years older than the time of Christ. Cities have been getting a bad rap for a very long time. But it's also true that country reigns over city even today in the popular imagination. And you can see this just by driving around or by going into the marketplace. Did you know that if you go just across the border into Missouri, you will very soon come to a grocery store that is the Country Fresh Market? And if you walk into the Country Fresh Market and you find yourself on the drink and beverage aisle, you can reach down and get yourself a canister of Country Time lemonade, either regular or the pink variety. And after you get yourself some Country Time lemonade, you can go over to the meat section and pick up a package of delicious Williams country sausage. And on your way out of the grocery store, you can stop by the ice cream stand near the front door and pick up an ice cream cone of country vanilla ice cream. And because I know all of you watched that fantastic victory by the Razorbacks over LSU last night, I'm sure that after you left the Country Fresh Market, you would drive into Springdale planning to go to Bud Walton Arena this week for the next basketball game, where you could, on your way to your seat, pick up a package of Hog Country snacks from the concession stand. Well, that's right. You can take pretty much any food or anything and slap country on it, and apparently it just makes it better. But notice what you don't find. You don't find people going into the grocery store asking for City Time lemonade. And nobody goes to the ice cream shop asking if they can get a cone of City vanilla ice cream. When it comes to country versus city, country just wins out every single time. Well, in the scripture passage from the Gospel of Luke this morning, we see a couple of Jesus' disciples who were not so keen on city life either. They are James and John. So who are James and John? Well, James and John were a couple of rough and tumble fishermen, members of a profession that flourishes out in the country. They're brothers. Their father was a man named Zebedee, and he was one that they walked away from in order to be able to follow Jesus. We also know that James and John were along with Simon Peter, were part of a smaller group of disciples who seemed to have been more intimate with Jesus than any others. And we see that in the Gospels. We see how even within the 12 disciples, Simon Peter and James and John would sometimes get separated out, and Jesus would go and do things with them and would confide in them, such that it appears as if he was closer to them even than the other 12. We also know something about the relationship that he had with those three from the fact that they were the three disciples that he gave nicknames to. Now, we don't often think about this, but Jesus had a sense of humor. And he chose Simon Peter and James and John to receive special nicknames that he called them by. With Simon Peter, it was just Peter. I mean, the man's name was Simon. Peter is a name that in Greek means rocky. That's a pretty good nickname, right? I'm going to call you Rocky. And he did that because Peter said he was going to be resolute and steadfast and he would never leave Jesus' side. Well, when it came to James and John, he had a nickname for them together. He called them Boanerges, which is a word that means the sons of thunder. Now, that'd be a pretty good name for like a professional wrestling tag team. I mean, if you're in ancient Israel, your rabbi calls you sons of thunder. I mean, he's either just ridiculing you or giving you really, really high praise. But we know something about why he called James and John the sons of thunder from the story that we read today. Because what this story tells us is that when Jesus had finished his ministry up in the Galilee, up there in the country, up in the rural area, that he had decided to, as one translation of the scripture says, to set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he gathered the 12 disciples with him, and they headed south to go from the country into the city of Jerusalem. But in order to get there, they have to travel through the region of course, Samaria. And Samaria is where the Samaritans live. And unfortunately for any pilgrims from the Galilee going up to Jerusalem, from the country to the city, they had to pass through the region of Samaria. And the Jews and the Samaritans were cousins of each other, but they really didn't get along very well. You see, they both saw themselves as descendants of the ancient Israelites, and they were. But the Samaritans resented the Jews because the Jews insisted that in order to worship God properly, you had to do so at the temple in Jerusalem itself. And so what's happening in the passage this morning is that they are traveling from the Galilee to Jerusalem, and they're going through the region of Samaria, and it takes a while to get through. So as they're approaching one of the cities of the Samaritans, Jesus sends the disciples on ahead of him to prepare some hospitality, to find out what restaurants are open so they can prop up their feet, get something to eat, probably get something to drink, take a load off. But you see, when the Samaritans find out that this rabbi and his group of pilgrims are Jews and that they're going on to Jerusalem, they don't want to have anything to do with them. They close up all of their shops, they shut their doors and windows, and they turn up their noses. Now, from James and John's perspective, this is just the height of offense. Because here it's their rabbi, it's the Son of Man, the Son of God in the flesh, who's walking into their city. He's gracing their city with his presence, and they don't want to have anything to do with him. And so they go to him and they say, Lord, would you like us to pull an Elijah on these guys? Would you like us to call up to God in heaven to grab a big fireball of fire and just throw it down and smash these people and burn their city to the ground? In other words, if they're going to reject you, Lord, we should reject them. And we shouldn't just reject them, but we should reject them in the most dramatic way possible by calling on God to reject them too. Well, it can be hard to see God's presence in the midst of the city sometimes. That's true. There's a reason that cities have gotten a bad rap since ancient times. I mean, what cities are is that they're concentrations of people. And so all of the problems that you and I carry around with us like luggage, well, those are just concentrated in a city because the people are more concentrated and in a confined area. So when it comes to things like crime and pollution and poverty, all of those things are worse in a city. And cities have also always been known as places of greater uncertainty economically and of greater instability politically. And this is actually the moral of the story of the city mouse and the country mouse. And what the country mouse says is, for all of the wonderful things, for all of the exhilarating, exciting things the city has to offer, I would rather live in my rustic simplicity out there in the country where there's not a whole lot going on than have to face danger possibly around every corner by staying in the city. But for all of its problems and all of its challenges, is that really a good reason to abandon the city? Is it a good reason for us to flee from the city? Or to ratchet it up a bit, is it a reason for God to abandon the city? Now, you see, when James and John wanted to call on God to cast a fireball down from heaven and consume that Samaritan town, Jesus, for his part, he rebuked them because he knew that that sort of thing is not the sort of business that God is about. You see, God wants to be in the city because that's where his children are. And even when his children reject him, as those Samaritans surely rejected God through Jesus that day, he will, like the shepherd leaving the 99 to go after the one, he will continue to search them out so that he might rescue them and bring them into redemption. Talking about the holy city itself, Jerusalem, Psalm 46 verse 5 says this. It says, God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when the morning dawns. That's about Jerusalem because, you know, the Israelites, they knew that God had chosen their city, that God had taken up residence there, and that the temple was, in a certain sense, the throne of God. The Holy of Holies, that was the place where God's spiritual presence was known to truly dwell. But what Christian believer, what do you and I know about what happened to that temple when Jesus died on the cross? You see, we know that rather than God remaining confined and constrained to the temple, that the curtain of the temple, the veil, that which separated the Holy of Holies from the rest, that it was torn in two at the moment that Jesus died. And that was the sign that God would not be confined there, but rather that the Spirit of God would leave the temple and would go out into all of the earth so that women and men of all ages, nations, and races might be called to receive salvation in him. And we know too, do we not, that when the Holy Spirit descended on Pentecost and the mission of the early church began, that God chose Peter and God chose Philip and God chose Paul and Barnabas and Timothy and all the rest. And he sent them out where? He sent them out to the cities around the Roman Empire. You see, God was determined not to abandon the cities, but God was determined to dwell in the midst of them, and not just to dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, but to dwell in the midst of all of the cities, because that's where his children were, and he wanted to seek them out. And that means that God now is in the midst of any city where there are people. God is in the midst of Springdale. God is in the midst of Fayetteville and Rogers and Bentonville and every other town and city in our land. You know, I mentioned last week that I wanted this sermon series to be one that we thought very practically about what it meant to let our light shine, what it meant to let our light shine in the world, both as a church, as a congregation, and also as individuals. And I want to ask that question this morning. I'd like for you to leave from here today asking that question. It's hard to believe we're already a month down in 2019, but that means that we have 11 more months to go. So we have 11 more months to ask how we can be a presence of God's light shining in the world, shining right here in downtown Springdale. I've told you before, one of the things that I love about this congregation, that I have been astounded by from the time that I arrived here in Springdale, is the strength of the foundation for mission and outreach that has been laid for decade after decade after decade by this congregation, seeing its mission right here on Johnson Avenue in downtown Springdale. Let me give you a few examples of that and how we've been in mission just in the past year. The print's a little small. I wanted to get a lot on there, so let me read it for you if it's hard to read. In our Bread of Life ministry, 1 block to the south of here, last year in 2018, we spent 450 hours in mission as a ministry. Now, that's not man hours, that's collectively. If you wanted to get the total number of man hours, you'd have to multiply 450 by all of the volunteers that we had. Not just when the Bread of Life was in operation, but when food was being collected, when the stockroom was being organized, all of the times that we have been in mission, it adds up to tens of thousands of hours over the past year. We spent $56,978 on food and financial assistance for Springdale citizens that are amongst the hardest hit and those who have the hardest time just making it by week in and week out. Some of that's food, some of that's helping people get their electricity turned on when it gets shut off, different forms of assistance. On average, we helped 2,025 people per month through the Bread of Life in 2018. Isn't that amazing? And if you look at our partnership with Monitor Elementary School, many of you know that Monitor is one of the poorest schools in the Springdale School District, that it has one of the highest percentages of children who are on free and reduced lunch, which is just a sign of the struggles that many of the families of Monitor Elementary students have just making ends meet on a week-in, week-out basis. In our snack pack program, what we're doing is we're helping to bridge the food insecurity that exists on the weekends. From the time when children leave on Friday afternoon, when we know they've been fed, until the time when they get back on Monday morning, when we know that the school can feed them again. Because there is that 2-day bridge of food insecurity, the snack packs that we send home with them help to make sure that they are going to have nutrition in their bellies during that 48 hours. And during the 2017-2018 school year, for 32 out of the 36 weeks of the school year, we packed snack pack supplies every week for 775 Monitor students, which equals 24,800 snack packs distributed last year. If you turn to our His Helping Hands clothing and housewares ministry, it's a lot newer. Started 3 years ago out of the Disciple Bible Study class that was members even in this own room that's right here that wanted to do something to continue to contribute after their Bible study ended. And so they founded His Helping Hands, and in 2018 there were 245 hours organizationally spent in mission. For man hours, you multiply that by the number of volunteers when they were working, it's thousands and thousands of mission hours. And in all of that, His Helping Hands distributed almost a ton, 1,875 pounds of clothing and housewares to needy families, families that could not afford to go to some of the stores where you and I might buy our clothing. And yet their clothing needs are no less than ours. So we were able to help meet that need for them. And did you know, whether you're talking about His Helping Hands or our partnership with Monitor or the Bread of Life, if none of that outreach work had been done, if none of that compassion had been done, if none of that light had been shined throughout Springdale in those ways, do you know who would have done it? If you all hadn't done it, do you know who would have done it? Nobody. Nobody would have done it. Because nobody asked us to. Nobody told us we were supposed to. Well, except one person did. Jesus. And what I want us to do, I want us to ask ourselves how we can make sure that 2019 looks like that. And maybe even more so. What can we be doing as a congregation? What can we be doing as a church? What can we be doing as individuals to let our light shine? Because remember the words of Jesus, let your light shine before others so that they'll see those good works, not to give glory to you, not to tell you how wonderful you are for doing them, but so that your good works will give glory to your Father in heaven. Let's do that together.